you all so much for coming to this Lake Steward webinar. I'm so glad that I get to share with you about this program. I'm also very glad that we have 4 guest speakers, Minnesota DNR research scientist Paul Radomski and Minnesota Public Radio's Kirsti Mahron, and they'll share a little bit about declining water quality through both of their research and work on this. Sue Henken-Thielen, who is an MLR board member, and a lake steward on Lake Washburn, Steve Corbin of Fox Lake, who is also a lake steward, but he'll share his perspective on what it's like to work as an evaluator for his association, how he's been able to spread this message to other neighbors. This will really be a story time to cover what's happened this summer. If you have any questions, I'm going to have my email up at the end of this webinar. Reach out with questions and comments and concerns and ideas or anything that's on your mind about Lake Steward. I want to hear about it. I'll pass it over to Paul to kind of help define the problem and talk about his research on the state of our lakes.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to you today. I want to talk a little bit about the state of the lakes as we understand it. In 2015, my colleagues and I, we developed a survey protocol to assess the nearshore condition of Minnesota lakes. Fisheries biologists and state botanists and others have been conducting these surveys since that time and have done over 800 lakes now. And Minnesota Natural Shoreline Partnership wanted to look at that data and say, well, what is the condition of Minnesota's shoreline? We looked through the data and we determined that we lost 40 to 50% of our natural shorelines, which for many folks, they were really surprised by that. First, that we could quantify it, and secondly, that it was so large. And then from other data that we had, we determined that we're losing about 1% to 2% of our natural shorelines, losing those per decade. Quantified the problem and indicated that we have a serious problem that's been created across many decades. Certainly in certain portions of the state, we are seeing better conditions of our shorelines, but average overall is some properties are really struggling with protecting that vital resource. So we know for lakes that phosphorus is the limiting nutrient that feeds algae and our vascular plant communities. So the more phosphorus you have in the water column, the greener the lake. In soil, farmers will measure phosphorus in parts per million, but in lakes, we measure in parts per billion. A very small amount of phosphorus in water has a profound influence on the clarity, the amount of algae that are produced in the water, as well as the nearshore vegetation. So we know that 1 pound of phosphorus will produce 500 pounds of algae. A lawn to the lake will produce 0.2 of a pound of phosphorus per lot per summer. Now you go, whoa, what 0.2 of a pound? That sounds, minuscule. But again, this is a different world. It takes very little. So you can think about the cumulative effects. If there's 100 lots around your lake that have a lawn down to their lake, they're contributing 20 pounds, and that transfers into 10,000 pounds of algae. So it adds up very quickly. And what's interesting, the science is really evolving and really come to understand this issue. USGS did a lot of studies where they put small sensors in on lawns next to the lake and then put them in natural vegetated areas nearby. And they computed that a lawn down to the lake will have 7 to 9 times greater amount of phosphorus pollution runoff than a naturally vegetated shoreline. These are the kind of new science that really are opening our eyes to the effect of how we're treating that near shore on our lake water quality. So I get a lot of questions into my office, either email or phone, to say, I've never seen it so bad this year. The algae is terrible. The weeds are terrible. Mm-hmm. And I say, well, what? Let's talk about it. What is the condition of your shoreline? Do you have natural vegetation along your shoreline, or do you have a lawn down to the lake? We'll talk about those consequences that I just mentioned with the lawn down to the lake. Where is your runoff coming from off your house? Is it getting absorbed into the soil, infiltrated, and captured by native vegetation? And if it's not, it's running right down to the lake and feeding the algae right off their dock. And I know a lot of people are smart, but they're just not aware of the science and the biology of living on a lake, which is, our responsibility to help walk people through that. We often see, too, is a correlation how people are treating that near shore, their land, and their aquatic area in front of their property. If they have a lawn to the lake, they might be removing some of the habitat, right? Like these logs that are warm-up logs for turtles that bask in the sun and get some energy. Or they might be removing water lilies that are important habitat for green and mink frogs. And all of a sudden, those organisms and those animals aren't around. I notice a lot of people are protecting their emerging vegetation, and that's very important for a lot of fish species. There's a bluegill. They'll often make their nest. The males will make their nest in the stands of bulrush, and the females will then deposit their eggs in those nests, and that provides some protection. Those bulrush and other emergent vegetation, whether it's arrowhead, some of the more flowery emergent vegetation, they hold the sediment in place, so they reduce erosion, and they provide habitat for young fish so that they can survive to become adults. And of course, we all love to see loons on our lakes. I just love seeing them, hearing them, watching them care for their young. The thing about loons is they need vegetated shorelines to nest. So that's the kind of habitat they're seeking out. And then often people don't appreciate is loons are site feeders. As we add phosphorus or pollutants to our lake and they get greener, the adults have a harder time to capture prey, which is often young fish, to feed to their young. As the lakes become more polluted and greener, they have very difficult time feeding their young. And because of this pollution, many of our southern Minnesota lakes no longer support nesting loons. I think that's sad. That should not happen. If we can change that, get everybody aware of the issues, that'd be great. Looking back a little bit further in history, here's some pictures of Pade-Makaska. That's wild rice growing there back in the 1890s. Those lakes look a lot different. They were beautiful. Not to say they're not beautiful now, but they have changed. In the 80s and 90s, when people called me when I was working for fisheries, they said, I'm looking for a house right on the water. I want an endless beach, no neighbors, crystal clear water. And I'm going, sounds like you want something in the Caribbean, because Minnesota, most of our lakes are not like that. Yes, you'll have beaches in some places under high energy shorelines, but it's usually confined. And oftentimes our lakes have naturally growing vegetation. That's part of the ecosystem. Today, I'm hearing more of, I want a beautiful house. Yes. I want a place on my property for the kids to play in the water, but I also want to protect water quality, provide fish and wildlife habitat. How can I do that? And that's been a nice change that I've been seeing for the people that are living on the lakes and engaging with us on how they can protect their water quality.
Thank you, Paul. I'm glad to hear that people have been reaching out to you more preemptively, because it seems it only becomes something we talk about or want to learn about when the algae is so thick outside of your dock. We can't all think about all of the aspects of lake ecology that you just described if we're not lake ecologists. Kirsti, you did a lot of research over the summer talking with people and kind of hearing more about what everyone thinks about this issue and how they're reacting to it.
Thanks for having me. My name is Kirsti Mahron, and I'm a correspondent for Minnesota Public Radio News. I'm based in central Minnesota. I actually live in Brainerd, and I work out of our Collegeville Bureau at St. John's University. So I get to cover a large part of Minnesota that has a lot of lakes, which is fun. And I cover water issues for NPR. And I'm going to talk about a project that I worked on this past summer for NPR, and we called it Trouble by the Water. The idea for this series had been brewing for quite a while because I grew up here in the Brainerd Lakes area, and I, like a lot of you, spent a lot of time on lakes, boating, swimming, sailing, canoeing. Back then, though, when I was a kid, the lakes up here looked a lot different. And I've watched them change as more people bought small cabins, tore them down, replaced them with large homes. That meant more roofs, driveways, patios. They cut down trees and, replaced natural vegetation with manicured lawns like we were seeing in Paul's photos. And there was this whole suburban aesthetic that I don't remember being as prevalent when I was growing up. So I knew I wanted to write about this change that I'd been seeing taking place and how it's affecting our lakes, but I didn't really know how to measure or quantify either the change or the impact. Then about a year ago, I learned that there are people who already are doing that, including Paul. So the Minnesota Natural Shoreline Partnership put out this report explaining that we're rapidly losing our natural shorelines, and we've lost about nearly half already in Minnesota. And also, why that's a critical problem. So people like Paul and others at the DNR have been assessing the condition and the quality of our lakeshore. And, that 50% or 40 to 50% number, it really got my attention. And I think it got a lot of people's. We decided to really dive in and, just look more deeply at what's happening, sort of what the causes are, and then possibly what could be done about it. And we wanted to really explore the real impacts that that loss has in terms of water quality, wildlife habitat, just that the natural beauty that Minnesotans love and value about their lakes. So we published a 5-day series, 5-part series, started in mid-August. The response was pretty overwhelming. I just checked today, and on the 5 stories combined, we had more than 96,000 page views. Engaged minutes is a way that we sort of measure how long people spend reading and interacting with a story. And for this series, people spent over 122,000 minutes reading and engaging with these stories. And then we also received a lot of feedback in the form of emails, calls, and just comments. People thanked us for doing the series and for drawing attention to a problem that they had observed, but they weren't really sure what to do about it. And part of the goal of our series from the beginning was not only to outline the problem of overdevelopment and the loss of natural shorelines, but also to highlight potential solutions. We really wanted to give people ideas for steps that they could take on their own property to change how they develop it and how they maintain their shoreline. So one of those solutions we explored was the Lake Steward program. And I got to visit Dorothy Whitmer at her home on Gull Lake. She talked about her own transformation of thinking, going from the idea that lakeshore must be neat and tidy to thinking that it's okay to be wild and free and to maybe, shut off that lawnmower and let things grow. There is a QR code if you weren't able to read this series that you can scan, and we've got all the stories on one page. You can also just Google NPR News Trouble by the Water, and you can find it that way too. But I think for me, the key takeaway that I took from working on the series was just that Minnesotans care very deeply about their lakes, and they recognize that those lakes have issues, but they're not entirely sure what to do about it. And they don't always understand the connection between what they do on their property and why the lake is turning green every summer, or their shoreline is eroding, or why they have geese in their yard. But they are open to doing better, especially when they understand how what they're doing on the land affects that lake that they love so much.
Thank you so much, Kirsti. I had similar key takeaways. I guess surprised by how many people came up to me and said, I saw the NPR series and it resonated with people. And often, if you want to do what everyone else is doing, and sometimes you feel alone, but I'm glad that this series and other efforts like Lake Steward are putting words to this issue that more than we know, people are seeing it and perceiving it. As we've been alluding to, there's this gap in our desire for healthy water quality and then our actions on our shorelines. How do we turn it around so that it's cool to promote and employ actions that take care of water quality instead of degrade them? Like Kirsti said, she's seen it's become the norm to have a golf course lawn. So how do we turn that around so that it's the norm to do things that actually make sense for water quality? Lake Steward is the way that we're trying to do that. Brief overview of how the program works. It gets interested individuals in contact with their lake association to pursue a shoreline evaluation. It's all volunteer-based. A lake association who's adopted the program will have a volunteer evaluator go on this site visit, and they'll have a survey tool to help them with their evaluation. And then if this property meets criteria that demonstrates that they are taking incremental steps to limit nutrient runoff and soil erosion in a way that shows they understand the connection between land and water, then they are awarded a Lake Steward sign. And they can showcase that sign on the end of their dock or somewhere on their property. This property owner gets congratulated and celebrated in this way by going above and beyond and taking care of their lake. And so it's positive, it's celebratory, it's all carrot and no stick. Part of the beauty of this happening within a lake association is that it's neighbor to neighbor. Lake stewards can get congratulated in their newsletter, and then another interested member will see it and kind of wonder what it's about. You'll see a sign on someone's lakeshore and you'll ask a question and say, what's going on here? In this way, it increases lake association capacity. It encourages people outside to join their lake association. They see what they're doing. It's kind of a snowballing thing. So the more signs are out there, the more water quality is being protected, and the more people know about it, and the more they can employ it in their own areas. We're going to hear from Sue next, who can tell us about her experience of first being concerned lakeshore property owner and then being a lake steward.
I would start by giving you a little background on me, because I've always been very passionate in environmental issues. And it may be because The very first Earth Day was on my birthday. Impressionable child, and thought, it must be a sign. I've always been very involved in recycling. I was the first recycling coordinator in my neighborhood in Minneapolis. And then when we bought our lake property, I very quickly joined MSRPO, which was the predecessor to MLR, which at that point was really fighting for tax fairness. And I joined because I felt it was so important to really protect our investment. I left for a few years with family and job obligations, and then I rejoined the MLR board at least 10 years ago. And, at that point, AIS was really a big issue, and my lake, Lake Washburn, had milfoils. So then I joined our fledgling AIS committee on Lake Washburn to address those issues. So as you can see, I've always had a real interest in sort of protecting the environment and protecting our waters and our land. And I have to admit, when I heard of Lake Steward, I thought it was a natural fit, and my competitive nature said, oh, I'm sure I know all about this, and my property is just probably perfect, because we have a lot of natural native plants from our shoreline out about 20 feet, and a third of our second lot is wetland. So I took the survey and, was kind of a little arrogant, and I found out that I really didn't know a lot. And so it was a really good education. And the thing that I really realized is we did have a lot of native plants, but a lot of them were invasive plants. First year that I was part of learning about Lake Steward, I spent a lot of time digging invasives out of my garden. And this year, the loosestrife came back with a vengeance. And so I was out digging out my loosestrife, and I had several neighbors come over and ask me why I was digging up these beautiful plants. And I realized, as both Paul and Kirsti mentioned, it is a matter of education. I think people really care about the lake, and they want to protect their financial investment, the amount of time and energy and emotional ties to the land, but they don't really know what to do. And so I think this program is so important, because as lake owners, we are the first line to protect our lakes. And if we don't take care of it, we can't expect others to do it. But I think the really positive thing is I have the signage on my road, and I have a lot of neighbors stopping by. And it's really interesting. They're always asking me questions like I'm an expert now. Should I use riprap? Is it really that bad? Should I bring in sand and make a beach? How terrible could that possibly be? Do I really have to stop killing my creeping Charlie? So, it really shows, I think, that there's interest and that this program is really engaging for people. And I think the biggest value is the building of community. You start to meet your neighbors, especially I'm on the committee, but I've only gone out to one other property right now. But it's really fascinating to meet with people. They have a lot of questions about what their property is like and what they need to do differently. And so I think of many of the programs that we've been involved in terms of MLR, this is one of the best for really bringing people in and engaging them. And I also want to just give a shout out to Scott Erickson, who is our leader. He's done a great job of promoting this program. Right now, we have about 10% of lake owners on the lake on board. And he told me recently we have several others that have expressed interest. The hardest part is just generating promotion. You can see on the picture on your screen on the top, we did a Lake Steward luncheon this spring, and Lily came up to join us, and these are our committee members. But we had a pretty good turnout and a good number of people reaching out to us after that. I actually suggested for our next newsletter that we put an article in on how to identify the invasive plants in your yard, because I think that was, for me, one of the easiest things to do. I think that people are interested, but since I went kayaking up my shore and saw loosestrife everywhere, I know people don't know. So I think that promoting it in those ways in the newsletter and in meetings and emails has really been beneficial for building up awareness. And I think probably word of mouth is the best way to do it. Bottom line, for me, this program has really engaged me, made me much more aware. It's a great way to build community on the lake. Sometimes problems seem so big, but if we each can take care of our own little piece on the lake, we can add that together and be protecting an entire lake soon.
Thank you, Sue. Steve, you want to talk about your experience as an evaluator and some other things that happened this summer?
Well, my lake and my experience is kind of a case study maybe that people could take away. But I got to be honest, we are a small lake, Fox Lake, northwest Minnesota. It's only 135 acres. Deepest point is 20 feet deep. It was pretty well developed by 1966. according to the DNR in their evaluation. But this lake also has a Secchi disc reading of 17 feet in the spring. It's all spring fed, no river coming in, and only a small exiting creek on the other side. And I've been there since 66. So for me, there were legacy concerns in getting involved with this. And thanks to Minnesota Lakes and Rivers advocates, brought me in on the tax issues years ago. Then they started in the aquatic invasive species issues. And all along, I'm learning. I'm a student. And when it came to the Lake Steward thing, I had to become a student again. There was mention of Dorothy Whitmer down on the Gull Lake chain. I have to say that the work that she did, that creativeness, that stepping forward, that being a pioneer, about how she had to come to grips with the fact that she had the wrong idea. She loved her house. She loved her lot. She loved her lake. She was proud of all of it, the landscaping, the shrubs, and all that stuff. And then she found out one day, oops, I think I've been on the wrong track. I then put on her moccasins and said, well, I love the lake and I've been on the lake for a long time and I want it to be nice and all that, but I don't know enough. And she showed me that I didn't know enough. Now, thanks to MLRA, DNR, and other resources, seminars, all kinds of things, I had to become a student and start learning from scratch. But you know what? This area, people are so empty on information and knowledge. It doesn't take much to become a relative expert pretty quick. And so I don't claim to be an expert, but I'd say relative expertise can come on very quickly. One of the challenges, the practical challenges, is how do you get started with this on a lake? I found out in my lake, they don't like going to association meetings in the summertime. You can bring food, it can be free. I had to try to figure out how we were going to do this. And I said, well, I'm going to become an icon. I'm going to get one of these signs hung up, see who will ask questions about it, and move on from there. But of course, first of all, I had to learn some things. So I got this beautiful little book here, Shoreline Guide to Lake Stewardship, which I think should be the owner's manual for anybody that owns lakeshore property. And it should be sitting on the first coffee table inside the front door, and it should never be moved. And it should be there because it's not everything, but it's as much as you need to get started. And then I said, well, look, I can't just go do this because the Lake Steward program operates through lake associations. So I went to our president and I said, there's this program that I would like to share with our membership. And we did have a meeting and I did share it about 3 years ago. And after that, I said, can I be the one that steps up to be the Lake Steward evaluator for our lake? Well, he was taken aback because nobody had ever volunteered for any job. And so I don't know if he's afraid to say no because I was enthusiastic, but he said yes. So with that, we started with every time there was an annual meeting or a communication about something like stocking fish, I would throw something in there about Lake Steward. And I found the same thing that the NPR found out. And that was that the people on my lake were really interested about preserving the lakes, perpetuating the legacy, and keeping it nice for all the kinds of activities that they want to do. Yes, property values, but I felt like it was even deeper than that. It was like they knew they were dealing with the crown jewels of the state of Minnesota, the 10,000 lakes, and they had a piece of it. What I had to do was show some examples of how this whole process of Lake Steward can be enriching, educational. You didn't need to be fearful, although some people questioned about having their property evaluated and where those results were going to go and who was going to hear about it and what might it mean. So we had to work through that. I got myself educated. I got myself trained in one of the seminars from Minnesota Lakes and Rivers advocates. And then I said, well, I have to get my hands wet with this. I evaluate a property. I can't go out and evaluate somebody else's property. They don't evaluate a property first. So I evaluated my property. And don't get worried, I've evaluated myself 4 times and I passed every time. But then after I evaluated my property, I felt like I had the courage to talk to somebody else. I talked to my neighbor on the right. I talked to my neighbor on the left. Both of them had been there for decades. Both of them cared for their property. But they didn't seem very knowledgeable about this. But I think out of deference to me, as their friend, they let me evaluate their property. And boom, boom, we got our first 2. Evaluations come back positive. We ordered the signs went up. Now we've got one there and one there and one there. It looks like it's 3 bowling pins lined up along the back road where Fox Lake is. That started generating some discussion. It's so handsome or pretty, however you want to describe it, that when people get these signs, they're really excited. They're really well made. They're really clear. And you get to put at the bottom of the sign the logo for your lake on the sign. So it personalizes for people. All of this peer-to-peer, no government involved, no top-down, it's lateral. And it's learning together and acting together. And it's really stepping up. I call it social action by the members of the association on behalf of a tremendous legacy. It goes slow at first. There was me, then there was 2 more, then I added a 4th, and then we went from 4 to 9 this last summer. We only have 52 property owners on the lake. I told Lily that we had 9 now. She said, "Oh, you're getting close to that target level of 15%. You may be the first lake that's done it." Well, I'm not saying that we're like what Dorothy did, because Dorothy's got, by God, maybe 1,000 people on multiple lakes on the chain. It's been a very positive experience. Keep humble. You're never an absolute expert like Paul on this, but you're a relative expert. And what I found personally was, in a pretty laid back, self-secure group of people, I've been able to help generate some interest. I don't think we're done. I think it's going to keep going. One of my latest awardees was so enthusiastic, he said he'd step up and become an evaluator, not because we're short-handed, but because we want to continue to promote and extend. And now he's gone out and recruited people who've been evaluated. It helps that he has got a scientific background as a meteorologist. So when he speaks about water, hydrology, and all that stuff, it really helps. It's a great experience. We had a unique experience this summer. There was a group of young people. I think they were both primary school and maybe a couple of middle school students that were in Detroit Lakes. And there was an intern from Minnesota Lake and River Advocates, Judy Lee, who was there this summer working with them on swimming lessons and those kinds of things. So I'm not sure how much exposure they had to natural environments. So we planned this day. Judy had been talking to them about natural environment, protecting both the land and the water and all that kind of stuff. So she brought these kids out, suburban kids out there to my place. And that day, what we decided to do was we were going to do a walkabout on a couple of lake properties and talk through things like maybe Mr. Wizard would have done 60 years ago on TV when I was a kid, and get them to touch things and get them to ask questions. So they came over, we did that stuff and for about 30 minutes, and then we walked down the shoreline to neighbors, and these young people presented Lake Steward awards to some of our awardees right there. It was role reversal. And it was intergenerational. We're not going to be able to preserve these lakes by people that are age 55 and older. We can carry the baton a little bit now, but we've got to get these younger people involved. Elementary school on up. And in my cottage, we have 4 generations of users right now. And I'm sorry, I know I bore them, I wear them out, and I'm giving them too many object lessons as grandpa and all that. But this intergenerational track is a track that we have to expand and make stronger. These young people were awarded junior Lake Steward certificates this summer. They're going to have a junior Lake Steward certificate on their CV, and they will have done hands-on experiences there. That's my story. I'm still learning. There's a long way to go. I thank Minnesota Lakes and River Advocate and everybody who's gotten involved in this program. And again, my patron saint, Dorothy Whitmer, for putting me on the right track. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Sue. You both do a really good job of putting words to this experience that you've had. The camp day where they got to do their evaluation, I was there, and it was a lot of fun. And you're right that it does need to be an intergenerational thing. I talked to a lot of lake home and cabin owners who say that they're trying to preserve them for their grandchildren and their children, and everybody has a stake in it. Lake Steward is a way to implement that sustainability. You can always learn and you can always get involved, even incrementally. To that end, Paul has made a really lovely and much more user-friendly tool to guide evaluators in their evaluations. And we tried it out last summer for the first time, and I've heard great feedback.
I'd love to do lake research, whether it's fish, frogs, or loons. My coworker, Josh Konopik, does some really good apps for our field staff across the state. And I have one app that our lake ecologists use across the state for shallow lakes, for deep water lakes, and for AIS. And I was looking for another app to develop. Jeff Forrester said, well, one of our challenges is we just don't have a good way of incorporating the data from the lake stewardship. So Lily and I created the Lake Steward app so that evaluators could more effectively assess a neighbor's stewardship, provide recommendations, etc. So Lily and I went iteratively about what would the form look like, kind of the questions, how would things be calculated, how to present it. This is the first iteration that's gone out for actual use, if we're always interested in improving it. What I like is it allows you to walk through a property going by section, the upshore, the near shore, and the aquatic, and just walk through that. Within the questions that you're evaluating, it gives you some pointers along the way. Looking at some other lake stewardship tools, Maine has one, several other states have their own. We kind of took the best of all of that. You can use either the free Survey 123 app to load that into your iPad, or you can go with phone or a tablet and use your web browser to actually submit your evaluations. The other feature that has the ability to generate a record or a report for an individual evaluation. Who is the evaluator? What are the scores? And then the recommendations that you provided to your neighbor. And then if you had any pictures along the way, they are appended to the end of this report. And it provides them a digital record of what happened. And of course, that it makes your work easier and provides you a straightforward and efficient way of collecting that information. I have been happy to help. I can add it to my competition with Josh to say that Lily and I also created this other app, and it appears to be working. Hundreds of people did evaluations this summer, and it was really great to see those results roll in. So well done.
Thank you, Paul. We're trying to figure out how to make this program the most useful and effective that it can be, and it is still growing and changing. Just to kind of wrap up what we've talked about, how it all connects into something bigger. And so it starts with one individual, and it has direct effect on their lakeshore right out in front of their dock. If they take incremental steps like widening their buffer zone by 10 feet. But then there's kind of a bigger story going on in tandem with these very tangible and incremental pieces of work on the ground. Water resources are fragmented. We don't have the infrastructure in place to handle all of the many different threats that are facing our lakes and rivers because we don't have a Department of Water. It needs to be people on the ground. There are other shoreline stewardship programs out there, and they're doing great work for water quality, but none of them are statewide like Lake Steward. On my little map here on the screen, these are all the data points that are loaded into the Survey 123 tool. As of now, there are some other lake stewards who have been awarded before we were using this tool, but it shows all across the state, even just this year. That is something that gives Lake Steward the capacity to change perceptions on the level that our lakes require. So it works directly to inform and organize a base of lake advocates right where they need to be to protect water. We kind of use this number, this 15%, as a magic number. We need 15% of a population to adopt a practice before it becomes kind of a social norm. We're looking for that, for it to become a movement. So we currently have 15% of Minnesota lakes and rivers lake associations carrying Lake Steward. This is big as of this year. That means that there is at least one Lake Steward sign up on 40 different lakes across the state, 21 different counties. So over 10 miles of Minnesota shoreline is protected this way just in a couple of years. I would love for 15% of properties on any given lake to have Lake Steward signs. Some lakes are close, some are further. Everyone doing this together will create that recognition that gives it a lot of power. Through all of this work, all of us listening to this webinar, or if you have a sign on your property, or if you're talking to your neighbors about it, we're creating a climate for water protection. Lake Steward is important, and it serves this higher purpose. Clean water is a public good, and we all have the capacity to help. Lake Steward grows and changes every year. It's still new, and it's informed by the work that we all put in. And if you want to help support this program, I'm going to give the floor to my colleague, Sammy Seltzer, Minnesota Lakes and Rivers Associate Director.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for being here. I'm the Associate Director, so I get to put my hands on just about everything related to MLR. And and I'm here today to talk to you guys about Give to the Max Day on November 21st. We are going to be dedicating this year's Give to the Max Day to the Lake Steward program to help us continue the great work. Early giving does start on November 1st. Consider giving a little bit back to Lake Steward on November 21st.
Thank you, Sammy. My email is on the screen. It is also on the Minnesota Lakes and Rivers website. Thank you so much.